My fiance's phone started ringing during our vows with wife on the caller ID. The church went completely silent except for that ringtone cutting through the sacred moment like a knife. Julian had promised to turn his phone off before the ceremony started, but there it was in his jacket pocket, buzzing insistently while the pastor held the Bible open between us. I watched Julian's face drain of all color as he reached for the phone with shaking hands. The caller ID lit up the screen clearly enough that the first 3 rows could see it. Wife. Not my name, Natalie. Not mom or office or any other explanation that would make sense. Just wife in all capital letters like an accusation. Julian fumbled with the phone and declined the call, shoving it back into his pocket while 150 wedding guests sat in stunned silence waiting for someone to explain what they'd just witnessed. The pastor cleared his throat and asked if everything was all right, his voice uncertain and awkward. Julian looked at me with panic in his eyes and said we should continue, that it was just a wrong number or a prank. But I'd seen his face the moment that screen lit up. That wasn't confusion or annoyance at a mislabeled contact. That was the expression of someone whose deepest secret just got exposed in front of everyone they knew. My hand started trembling so badly I dropped my bouquet on the altar steps. Julian bent to pick it up for me and whispered urgently that he could explain everything. But not here. Not now. Please, just let us finish the ceremony. His voice was desperate and pleading in a way I'd never heard before. My maid of honor, Simone, stepped forward and touched my elbow gently, asking if I needed a moment. I looked past Julian at the crowd of faces staring at us, my parents in the front row looking confused and worried. Julian's mother sitting rigid with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. His father leaning forward like he was trying to read Julian's expression from 15 feet away. My college friends whispering to each other behind their hands. Julian's co-workers from the law firm where he worked as a corporate attorney, all watching with professional interest like this was a case study in disaster management. The phone started ringing again, and Julian pulled it out immediately this time, hitting decline faster. But I saw the screen. Wife calling again. The persistence suggested this wasn't a mislabeled contact or a confused ex-girlfriend. This was someone who expected him to answer. Someone who had a claim on him that I didn't know about. I heard my own voice say clearly and loudly enough for everyone to hear that we needed to pause the ceremony. The pastor nodded quickly like he'd been hoping someone would say that. Julian grabbed my hand and tried to pull me aside, saying we could talk privately for just 2 minutes and clear this up. But I yanked my hand away and told him to answer the phone right here in front of everyone. If he had nothing to hide, he could answer it on speaker. Julian's face went even paler, and he said that wasn't fair, that whatever was happening needed to be handled privately. I told him he lost the right to privacy when someone labeled wife called him during our wedding vows. The church was so quiet I could hear people breathing. Julian stood there holding his phone as it started ringing for the 3rd time, and I watched him make a decision. He answered it. His hand was shaking as he held the phone to his ear and said hello in a voice that sounded nothing like himself. I couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but I watched Julian's face cycle through emotions. Shock, fear, anger, resignation. He said, "I can't talk right now," and the voice on the other end got louder. Loud enough that people nearby could hear a woman's voice saying something about papers and lawyers and custody. Julian said, "This isn't the time," and tried to hang up, but the woman's voice got even louder, screaming now. Julian looked at me with something like desperation and said he was so sorry that he never meant for any of this to happen. That's when I grabbed the phone from his hand and put it on speaker before he could stop me. The woman's voice came through crystal clear in the silent church. She was crying and angry at the same time, words tumbling over each other about how Julian promised he'd handle the divorce paperwork before moving forward with any wedding plans. She said she'd been calling his lawyer all week and couldn't get through to anyone. She said their daughter was asking when Daddy was coming home and she didn't know what to tell her anymore. I stood there holding the phone listening to this stranger talk about divorce and daughters and broken promises while my wedding guests processed what they were hearing. Julian tried to take the phone back, but I stepped away from him, keeping it out of his reach. The woman on the phone said, "Julian, please, you can't just pretend we don't exist." And I finally found my voice enough to ask who she was. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the woman said, "Who is this?" in a voice that had gone suddenly careful. I told her my name was Natalie and I was apparently about to marry her husband. Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said her name was Elise Ashford, and she'd been married to Julian for 6 years. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Claire. Julian had left them 8 months ago, saying he needed space to figure things out, but he'd promised the separation was temporary and they'd work on their marriage. He'd been living in an apartment across town and visiting Claire every weekend. Elise had no idea he was with someone else, let alone planning a wedding. Her voice broke on the last sentence and I felt my legs go weak beneath me. Simone caught me under one arm and my sister Bridget rushed forward to support the other side. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered on the marble floor of the altar. Julian picked it up and ended the call, then looked at me with tears streaming down his face. He started talking fast, saying yes. He was technically still married, but he'd filed for divorce months ago and just hadn't told me because he didn't want to complicate things. He said it wasn't a real marriage anymore. They'd been separated and the relationship was completely over. He He said he loved me, and only me, and everything with Elise was ancient history that was just taking time to legally resolve. Every word sounded like a rehearsed excuse, the kind of explanation a lawyer would construct when caught in a lie. I looked at him standing there in his expensive wedding suit and realized I didn't know this man at all. The Julian I thought I knew wouldn't hide a wife and child. The Julian I thought I knew wouldn't lie about something this massive for however long we'd been together. I asked him when he filed for divorce. He hesitated and said he'd started the paperwork in the spring. I asked him to be specific about what month. He said April or maybe May. He'd have to check the exact date. I told him we met in February and got engaged in July, which meant either he'd met me while fully married with no separation at all, or he'd left his wife and child, immediately started dating me, and filed for divorce while we were already together. Either way, he'd lied to me about his entire life. Julian tried to argue that the timeline didn't matter because his marriage was already over in his mind when he met me. I asked him if Elise knew the marriage was over in February when he was apparently still living at home with her and their daughter. Julian's silence was answer enough. My father stood up from the front pew and walked toward the altar with a look on his face I'd never seen before. He asked Julian directly how long he'd been lying to his daughter. Julian stammered that he'd never lied to me. He just didn't tell me certain things because the timing never felt right. My father said that lying by omission was still lying and asked again how long. Julian admitted we'd been together for 10 months. My father asked when exactly Julian had left his wife. Julian said 8 months ago. The math was obvious to everyone in the church. Julian had met me, dated me for 2 months while still living with his wife and child, and only left his family after he was sure I was a viable replacement. My father turned to me and asked what I wanted to do. I looked at Julian and told him the wedding was off. Chaos erupted immediately. Julian grabbed my arms and begged me not to do this, saying we could work through it and he'd explain everything if I'd just give him a chance. I pulled away from him and told him he'd had 10 months to explain and chose to lie instead. Julian's mother rushed to the altar crying and saying this was all a misunderstanding. She looked at me with desperation and said Julian loved me so much and I couldn't throw that away over a phone call. I told her the phone call was from his wife, who I didn't know existed, and if she knew about Elise and didn't tell me, she was complicit in his lies. Julian's mother's face crumbled and she looked at her husband who had stayed seated. His father stood slowly and walked to where Julian was standing. He asked his son if this was true, if he'd really been married this whole time. Julian said yes, but it was complicated. His father said it seemed pretty simple actually, then turned and walked out of the church without another word. The pastor announced to the guests that the ceremony would not be continuing and thanked everyone for coming. The relief on his face was visible as he closed the Bible and stepped back from the altar. Guests started standing and gathering their things, whispering to each other while staring at Julian and me. Simone put her arm around my shoulders and asked what I needed. I told her I needed to leave immediately, but first I needed to know everything. I turned back to Julian and asked him about Claire. He said she was 4 years old and lived with Elise full-time, that he saw her on weekends usually. I asked if he'd been seeing his daughter on the weekends. He told me he was working or visiting his parents. Julian looked at the ground and nodded. Every single piece of our relationship recontextualized itself in my mind. The weekends he couldn't see me. The evenings he had to cut short for work emergencies. The way he never wanted to video call, only text. The fact that he'd never invited me to his apartment. Red flags I'd ignored or explained away because I trusted him. I asked where he was living now. Julian said he had a small place downtown, and he'd been meaning to have me over once he got it properly furnished. I asked if Elise knew where that apartment was. He said yes, she had the address for Claire's visits. I asked if he'd told me the truth about anything at all. Julian said everything about his feelings for me was true, that he really did love me and want to marry me. He said the situation with Elise was just complicated baggage he didn't know how to bring up without scaring me away. I told him the situation wasn't baggage. It was a wife and child he'd abandoned while convincing another woman to marry him. I told him he'd built our entire relationship on lies and I wanted nothing to do with him. Julian started crying harder and said I was the best thing that ever happened to him and he couldn't lose me. I said he should have thought of that before proposing to me while still legally married to someone else. My mother appeared at my side and said we needed to go to the bridal suite so I could change and compose myself. I let her guide me away from Julian and the altar while he stood there crying and calling my name. Simone and Bridget followed us into the bridal suite and closed the door behind us, blocking out the noise of the departing guests. I sat down on the couch and just stared at the wall, while my mother started unhooking the dozens of tiny buttons running down the back of my dress. Simone knelt in front of me and asked if I was okay, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Bridget was already on her phone researching lawyers. She said we needed to contact the venue about deposits and cancel the honeymoon immediately. The practical logistics of undoing a wedding felt overwhelming when I was still processing that my fiancé had a whole secret family. Someone knocked on the door and Simone opened it a crack. Julian's voice came through asking to please talk to me alone for just 5 minutes. Simone told him no and started to close the door, but he pushed it open and forced his way into the room. My mother stepped between us immediately and told him to leave or she'd call security. Julian said he wasn't leaving until I heard him out. He said yes, he'd made mistakes and lied about things, but his feelings for me were completely real. He said he'd fallen in love with me and realized his marriage to Elise had been dead for years. He said they'd been unhappy and disconnected long before I came into the picture. He said leaving Elise wasn't about me. It was about finally admitting the marriage didn't work. None of this explained why he'd hidden it from me for 10 months. None of it explained why I'd found out about his wife and child from a phone call during our wedding vows instead of from him directly. I asked Julian when he'd planned to tell me about Elise and Claire. He said he'd tried to bring it up several times but could never find the right moment. I asked if he'd planned to tell me before the wedding, or if he thought he could just marry me while still legally married to someone else. Julian looked confused and said of course he would have told me before we actually went through with the ceremony. He just needed to get the divorce finalized first. I pointed out that we were literally in the middle of the ceremony when I found out, so apparently his timeline was to tell me never. Julian said the divorce was taking longer than expected because Elise kept complicating things and asking for more time. I asked if Elise knew he was getting remarried. His silence told me everything. He'd kept both of us in the dark about each other, telling Elise they might reconcile while promising me forever. Bridget looked up from her phone and said she'd found Elise on social media. She showed me a Facebook profile with photos of a pretty woman with dark hair and a small girl who looked exactly like Julian. The most recent photos were from 2 months ago. Pictures of Claire at a birthday party with both parents smiling in the background. Pictures of the three of them at a park with the caption, Family Day. Pictures of Elise and Julian at what looked like a nice restaurant with wine glasses and candlelight. I looked at the dates and felt sick. These photos were from August, 1 month after Julian proposed to me. He'd taken me to a beach for the weekend and gotten down on one knee and told me I was his forever. Then apparently the next weekend he'd taken his wife out for a romantic dinner while I was at home planning a wedding to a man who was playing both of us. I asked Julian if he was still sleeping with Elise. His face answered before his mouth did. He said it had only happened a few times and it didn't mean anything, that he'd been weak and felt guilty about Claire. He said Elise kept pushing for them to try again for their daughter's sake, and he'd given in a couple times but it was a mistake. I asked when the last time was. He said he didn't remember exactly. I asked if it was before or after he proposed to me. Julian said maybe after, but he couldn't be sure of the exact dates. Simone said, "Oh my God," from behind me. My mother made a sound like she'd been punched. Bridget told Julian he needed to leave right now before she called the actual police instead of just venue security. Julian said he wasn't going anywhere until I agreed to talk this through rationally. My father opened the door at that moment and took in the scene. Julian standing too close to me while I sat on the couch in my wedding dress. My mother looking furious. Bridget holding her phone like a weapon. He asked Julian if he'd been asked to leave. Julian said yes, but he needed to make Natalie understand. My father said the only thing anyone needed to understand was that Julian was a liar who'd betrayed his wife, his child, and my daughter. He told Julian to get out of the room in the next 10 seconds, or he'd remove him physically. Julian looked at my father and must have seen something in his expression that finally convinced him to back down. He walked toward the door but turned back at the threshold and said he'd call me later so we could talk when I was calmer. I told him not to ever contact me again. He opened his mouth to argue, but my father took a step toward him and Julian left. The bridal suite went quiet except for my mother's hands still working on the buttons of my dress. Simone sat down next to me and said she was so sorry this happened. Bridget said she'd never liked Julian and wished she'd said something months ago. I asked what she meant and she said Julian always seemed too smooth, too rehearsed in how he acted. She said he reminded her of her ex-boyfriend who'd also turned out to be a liar. I asked why she'd never mentioned this before, and she said I'd seemed so happy and she didn't want to ruin it with her own baggage. I told her next time to please ruin it and save me from marrying a married man. The absurdity of the situation finally hit me, and I started laughing in a way that sounded slightly unhinged. My mother said I was in shock and needed to breathe slowly. Simone got me a glass of water from the suite's bathroom. My phone buzzed in my clutch purse on the side table. Bridget grabbed it and looked at the screen, then asked if I wanted to see. I nodded, and she showed me a text from an unknown number. "This is Elise. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, trying to figure out what Julian's wife could possibly want to say to me. Bridget asked if I wanted her to respond or just block the number. I took the phone and typed back yes, because I needed to understand what had actually been happening while I'd been living in Julian's fantasy world. Elise responded immediately, asking if we could meet somewhere today. I looked at my mother, who was finally finishing with the last button on my dress. I told Elise I'd meet her at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the church in 1 hour. She sent back a thumbs up emoji, and I felt the surreal nature of arranging to meet my fiancé's wife after my failed wedding ceremony. I changed into the casual dress I'd brought for after the reception and washed off my makeup in the bathroom sink. My face in the mirror looked pale and shocked, like someone else entirely. Simone came in and stood behind me, meeting my eyes in the reflection. She asked if I was sure I wanted to meet Elise right now while everything was so raw. I said I needed answers that only she could provide. I needed to know how much of my relationship with Julian had been real versus how much had been constructed lies. Simone said she was coming with me, and I didn't argue. Bridget announced she was coming too. My mother said all 3 of us were going, and my father could handle canceling the reception and dealing with the venue. My father hugged me before we left and told me he was proud of how strong I was being. I didn't feel strong. I felt like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. The coffee shop was mostly empty when we arrived. I sat at a corner table with Simone on one side and Bridget on the other. My mother stood near the entrance watching the door. 15 minutes later, a woman walked in holding a small girl's hand. Elise looked exactly like her photos, but more tired. Claire was wearing a princess dress and light-up sneakers. She was adorable in a way that made my chest hurt because this child's life had been disrupted by Julian's lies just like mine had. Elise saw us and walked over slowly, telling Claire to sit at a nearby table with her tablet for a few minutes while Mommy talked to some people. Claire obeyed without question, clearly used to adult conversations she wasn't part of. Elise sat down across from me and we just looked at each other for a moment, two women who'd both been betrayed by the same man. Elise spoke first, apologizing for calling during the ceremony. She said she'd been trying to reach Julian all week about custody paperwork, and he kept avoiding her calls. She didn't know he was getting married today until his mother accidentally mentioned it during a phone call last night. Julian's mother had thought Elise knew about the wedding and made some comment about how exciting it was. Elise had been in shock all night trying to figure out what to do. She'd called the church this morning to confirm there was actually a wedding happening. When they confirmed it, she'd started calling Julian over and over hoping to stop him before he committed bigamy. She never imagined he'd actually answer during the vows. She thought he'd see her calls before the ceremony started and call her back. I told her she'd done the right thing, and I was grateful she'd saved me from unknowingly marrying a married man. Elise asked how long Julian and I had been together. I told her 10 months. She nodded slowly and said that lined up with when things had gotten weird between them. She said Julian had started working late more often around February. He'd been distant and distracted. She'd thought maybe he was stressed about a big case at work. In March, he'd started talking about needing his own space, and maybe they should try a separation. Elise had been confused because while their marriage wasn't perfect, it wasn't bad either. They'd been going through a rough patch, but she thought they were working through it. Julian had insisted he needed to move out and figure himself out. He'd said it wasn't about anyone else. He just needed time alone. He'd rented an apartment and moved out in April, telling Elise the separation was temporary and they'd reassess after a few months. I did the math in my head. Julian and I had started dating in February. We'd been together 2 months before he even moved out of the house he shared with his wife and daughter. I asked Elise if Julian had been coming home every night during February and March. She said yes, every single night. He'd had dinner with her and Claire, helped with bedtime, slept in their bed. Some mornings he'd make Claire pancakes before taking her to preschool. I felt nauseous thinking about Julian living his normal family life while texting me about how much he missed me and couldn't wait to see me. Elise said after he moved out in April, he'd established a weekend custody schedule with Claire. Every Saturday and Sunday, he'd pick Claire up in the morning and bring her back Sunday evening. Elise had assumed he was spending those weekends alone in his apartment working through whatever personal crisis had prompted the separation. I told Elise that Julian had spent most of those weekends with me. We'd gone on trips together, stayed at hotels, spent entire days and nights together, while his daughter was apparently waiting for him to pick her up. Elise's face crumpled and she said there were weekends when Julian had canceled at the last minute, saying he had to work. Claire would cry because she'd been excited to see Daddy and he'd call to say something came up. Elise had felt bad for him, thinking he was overwhelmed with work stress on top of their separation. She'd never imagined he was canceling on his daughter to be with another woman. I told Elise about the engagement in July. Her face went even paler and she said July was when Julian had started talking about reconciliation. He'd told her maybe the separation had been a mistake. He'd taken her to dinner and suggested they try couples counseling. They'd slept together several times that month while supposedly working on their marriage. Bridget made a disgusted sound from beside me. Simone had her hand over her mouth, looking horrified. My mother was standing behind me now with her hands on my shoulders. Elise said Julian's hot and cold behavior had continued through the fall. Some weeks he'd be attentive and talk about moving back home. Other weeks he'd be distant and say he still needed more time. Elise had been confused and hurt, but hopeful they could fix things. She'd never suspected another woman was involved because Julian had always been so adamant that the separation was about him needing space, not about anyone else. She'd believed him because, why wouldn't she? They'd been married for 6 years. They had a child together. She'd trusted that he'd be honest with her even if he was going through something difficult. The fact that he'd been planning a whole wedding while telling her they might get back together was so cruel she couldn't process it. I asked Elise about the divorce paperwork. She said Julian had filed in May but then kept dragging his feet on every step. His lawyer would send documents and Julian would take weeks to respond. When Elise's lawyer tried to schedule mediation sessions for custody and asset division, Julian kept rescheduling. Elise had thought maybe he was having second thoughts about the divorce and hoping they'd reconcile. She'd been encouraged by his delays, thinking it meant he still loved her. Now she realized he'd been stalling the divorce so he could keep both of us on the line. If things with me hadn't worked out, he'd probably have gone back to Elise full-time. If things with me had progressed, he'd have eventually pushed through the divorce and erased Elise from his history. He'd been hedging his bets with both our lives while his daughter suffered in the middle. I asked about Claire and how she was handling everything. Elise's eyes filled with tears, and she said Claire kept asking when Daddy was moving back home. Elise had been telling her that Mommy and Daddy needed some time apart, but it didn't mean they didn't love her. She'd thought she was being honest while protecting Claire from adult problems. Now she had to figure out how to explain that Daddy had a whole other life and had been lying to everyone. She said Claire loved Julian so much and didn't deserve any of this. I looked over at the little girl sitting alone at the other table, absorbed in her tablet, and felt rage at Julian for hurting this innocent child who'd done nothing wrong. Whatever lies he'd told me, whatever betrayal I felt, Claire's pain was worse because she was 4 years old, and her entire family structure was built on her father's deception. Elise asked what I was going to do about Julian. I told her I'd told him never to contact me again, and I meant it. There was no coming back from this level of betrayal. Elise nodded and said she'd be filing for full custody and minimal visitation. She said Julian had proven he couldn't be trusted, and she wasn't letting him damage Claire any more than he already had. She said her lawyer had told her the bigamy attempt, even though it didn't go through, would help her case in custody court. A man who tries to marry another woman while still married shows poor judgment and moral character. I told Elise I'd testify if she needed me to. I'd provide any documentation or evidence that would help her protect Claire. Elise grabbed my hand across the table and thanked me, crying openly now. She said she'd thought she'd hate me when we met, but instead she just felt sad for both of us. We sat there for another hour while Elise told me more details about her marriage to Julian, how they'd met in college and he'd seemed so charming and ambitious, how he'd proposed after law school and they'd had a nice wedding with both families celebrating, how Claire had been born 2 years later and Julian had seemed like a devoted father at first. But over time, she'd noticed him getting restless and distant. He'd started working longer hours and being on his phone constantly. Elise had chalked it up to career stress and new parenthood exhaustion. She'd tried to be understanding and supportive. She'd never imagined he was cultivating a whole secret relationship. Looking back now, she could see signs she'd missed or explained away, times when his stories didn't quite add up. Weekends, he said he was at the office, but his location on the family app showed him somewhere else entirely. I told Elise about my own red flags I'd ignored. How Julian never wanted me at his apartment. How he'd never integrated me into his family or introduced me to his friends from college. How he'd always paid for everything in cash so there wouldn't be credit card records. How he'd been vague about his past relationships and changed the subject whenever I asked detailed questions. How he'd rushed the engagement, proposing after only 5 months of dating. I'd thought it was romantic spontaneity. Now I saw it was manipulation. He'd wanted to lock me in before I could discover the truth. If we'd gotten married today, I might not have found out about Elise and Claire for months or even years. Julian had gambled that he could get away with bigamy, or that the divorce would finalize right before the wedding, and no one would ever know the timeline. Elise said Julian's mother had called her this afternoon crying and apologizing. She said Julian's mother had known about me for months, but Julian had convinced her the marriage to Elise was over and the divorce was nearly final. He'd told his mother that telling Elise about me would just cause unnecessary drama when the relationship was already dead. His mother had believed him because she wanted to believe her son was a good man who'd fallen in love again after his marriage fell apart. She hadn't realized he was still sleeping with Elise and promising reconciliation while planning a wedding to me. When the truth came out during the ceremony, she'd been horrified. She'd called Elise to apologize for being complicit in Julian's deception. Elise said she'd accepted the apology because Julian's mother had been manipulated too, just less directly than us. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I declined it, and it immediately called again. Bridget grabbed my phone and answered it, putting it on speaker. Julian's voice came through asking why I wasn't answering and saying we really needed to talk. Bridget told him this was Natalie's sister and she was busy talking to his wife. Julian went quiet for a moment, then said, I shouldn't be talking to Elise because she'd just tell lies to turn me against him. Elise leaned toward my phone and said hello to Julian in a cold voice. She told him she'd found out about the wedding and about me and about all his lies. She said she'd be speaking to her lawyer first thing Monday morning about full custody. She said he should expect to hear from the State Bar Association too, because she'd be filing an ethics complaint about his conduct. Lying to clients was one thing, but attempting bigamy while representing yourself as an officer of the court was another level entirely. Julian started talking fast, saying Elise was overreacting, and he'd made mistakes but nothing illegal had actually happened. Elise cut him off and said attempting to marry someone while already married was in fact illegal, regardless of whether the ceremony completed. She said she'd checked with her lawyer already. Julian had committed fraud and deception and there would be consequences. Julian's voice got desperate and he asked to talk to me directly. I took the phone from Bridget and told Julian I had nothing to say to him. He said I was making a huge mistake throwing away what we had over a misunderstanding. I told him the only misunderstanding was me thinking he was a decent human being. He said that wasn't fair, and he'd only lied because he loved me too much to lose me. I said if he'd loved me at all, he wouldn't have built our entire relationship on deception. I hung up and blocked his number. Elise and I exchanged contact information before she left with Claire. She said we should stay in touch because we'd both need support dealing with the fallout from Julian's lies. I agreed and we hugged awkwardly in the parking lot while Claire watched from her car seat looking confused about why Mommy was crying and hugging strangers. I watched them drive away and felt hollowed out. My wedding day had turned into the day I learned my entire life for the past 10 months had been fiction. The man I'd thought I was marrying didn't exist. He'd been a character Julian played while maintaining his real life with his real family. I'd been the other woman without knowing it, which somehow felt worse than if I'd been complicit. At least then I'd have chosen the role instead of being tricked into it. The drive back to my apartment felt endless. Simone sat in the back seat with me while Bridget drove, and my mother sat in the passenger seat making phone calls to cancel vendors. The florist, the DJ, the photographer, the caterer. Every call was a small humiliation, explaining that the wedding was called off and we'd need to discuss refund policies. Some vendors were understanding and sympathetic. Others were businesslike and talked about their cancellation clauses. My mother handled all of it with calm efficiency while I stared out the window at the city passing by. I'd driven these streets with Julian dozens of times. He'd held my hand at stoplights and kissed me at red lights and told me he couldn't wait to spend forever with me. Every sweet moment had been a calculated lie. When we got to my apartment, Simone and Bridget stayed the night. We ordered pizza and sat on my couch watching trashy reality TV, not really paying attention to the screen. Around midnight, Bridget pulled out her laptop and started searching Julian's name online. She found his law firm profile with his professional photo and impressive credentials. She found his LinkedIn showing his career progression. She found old college photos of him and Elise looking young and happy. She found the public divorce filing from May with all the legal details. The case was still open, pending settlement negotiations that Julian had been deliberately stalling. Bridget found Julian's bar association profile and screenshot it, saying she'd help Elise with her ethics complaint if needed. She'd worked as a paralegal before going back to school and knew how to document everything properly. Simone asked if I'd had any indication at all that Julian wasn't single. I thought back over 10 months of memories and tried to find the clues I'd missed. He'd always been vague about his living situation, saying he'd just moved and was still getting settled. He'd never invited me to stay over, claiming his place was too messy, or he didn't have proper furniture yet. He'd rarely video called, preferring texts and phone calls. He'd kept his phone face down when we were together, and had been protective of it in a way I'd noticed but dismissed. He'd been unavailable every Saturday and Sunday, which he'd explained as custody time with his daughter from a previous relationship, except he'd said the mother was an ex-girlfriend, not a wife. He'd said they'd never been serious and co-parenting was the extent of their relationship, another lie in a web of lies. I'd met Julian at a friend's party in February. He'd approached me at the bar and we'd talked for hours about books and travel and career ambitions. He'd seemed genuinely interested in everything I said. He'd been charming without being overbearing, funny without being obnoxious, confident without being arrogant. I'd given him my number and we'd started texting constantly. Our first date was dinner at a nice Italian restaurant where he'd asked thoughtful questions and listened attentively to my answers. Our second date was a walk through the botanical gardens where he'd held my hand and kissed me under the cherry blossoms. I'd thought I was living in a romantic comedy. Now I saw it was psychological thriller where I'd been the clueless victim the whole time. Monday morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time since the non-wedding. Simone and Bridget had gone home Sunday evening after making me promise to call if I needed anything. I lay there looking at my ceiling and thinking about how I'd imagined waking up this morning married and happy, probably on a flight to our honeymoon in Greece. Instead, I was alone and heartbroken with a mountain of wedding expenses and no relationship to show for it. My phone showed 23 missed calls from unknown numbers that were probably Julian using different phones. He'd left voicemails begging me to talk to him. I deleted them all without listening. My email had messages from confused wedding guests asking what happened and if I was okay. I ignored those too. I couldn't explain to 150 people that my fiancé had a secret wife. Elise texted that morning saying she'd met with her lawyer and filed for an emergency custody hearing. She'd provided documentation about Julian's attempted bigamy and pattern of deception. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday. She asked if I could provide a written statement about my relationship with Julian and what he'd told me about his marital status. I said yes immediately and spent the next several hours writing a detailed timeline. I documented every lie Julian had told me about his living situation, his past relationships, his availability on weekends. I attached screenshots of his texts claiming to be at work when Elise said he was supposed to be with Claire. I included photos of us on dates during times he'd told Elise he was alone working on himself. Every piece of evidence felt like driving a nail into the coffin of the man I'd thought I loved. On Wednesday, Julian showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called up to ask if I wanted to see him, and I said absolutely not. The doorman said Julian was insisting it was important and refusing to leave. I called my father, who arrived 15 minutes later with my uncle. They went downstairs and handled Julian while I watched from my window 5 floors up. I saw Julian arguing with them, gesturing wildly. I saw my father get very close to Julian's face and say something that made Julian step back. My uncle stood with his arms crossed, looking intimidating. Julian finally got back in his car and drove away. My father called from the lobby to say Julian had been told in no uncertain terms to stay away from me or face legal consequences. I thanked him and broke down crying because I hated that my family had to protect me from someone I'd almost married. Thursday, I went to the courthouse with Elise to provide my statement at the custody hearing. Julian's lawyer tried to argue that the relationship between Julian and me had no bearing on his relationship with his daughter. Elise's lawyer presented my written statement along with all the documentation showing Julian's pattern of deception and manipulation. She argued that a parent who lies systematically to multiple people over an extended period demonstrates poor judgment and lack of moral character. She said Claire deserved a stable home environment, not exposure to her father's chaotic double life. The judge reviewed everything and asked Julian directly if he'd been planning to marry another woman while still married to Elise. Julian's lawyer tried to object, but the judge insisted on an answer. Julian admitted yes, but said the circumstances were complicated. The judge asked how circumstances could complicate attempting bigamy. Julian stammered that his marriage to Elise was over emotionally, even if the paperwork wasn't finished. The judge asked why he hadn't disclosed his marital status to me. Julian said he'd been afraid of losing me. The judge asked if lying to me had been fair or ethical. Julian said no, but he'd been in a difficult position. The judge said the only difficult position was the one Julian had put his wife, daughter, and fiancé in through his deception. She ruled that Julian would have supervised visitation only until the divorce was finalized, and he completed mandatory counseling about honesty and parenting. She said Claire's stability was paramount, and Julian's recent behavior showed he prioritized his own desires over his daughter's needs. Julian's lawyer tried to argue for more generous custody, but the judge was firm. The ruling stood. I watched Julian's face as the judge delivered her decision. He looked shocked and angry, like this was a betrayal rather than consequences for his own actions. He glanced back at me sitting in the gallery, and I met his eyes without flinching. I'd loved him so completely, and now felt nothing but cold contempt for the man who'd used me as a pawn in his midlife crisis. After the hearing, Elise hugged me outside the courtroom and said my testimony had made the difference. Her lawyer said having a corroborating witness to Julian's lies had given them credibility they wouldn't have had with just Elise's word. I told them I'd do whatever else they needed. Elise said she'd keep me updated on the ethics complaint and the divorce proceedings. We promised to stay in touch as the two women who'd survived Julian's deception together. Over the next month, I focused on rebuilding my life. I'd lost some money on non-refundable wedding deposits, but most vendors had been understanding. I'd kept my apartment through the engagement rather than moving in with Julian, which now felt like subconscious self-preservation. I threw myself into work at the marketing firm where I'd been building my career. My boss had been sympathetic when I explained I needed some time off after a family emergency. She'd given me a week and told me to take whatever time I needed beyond that. I'd only taken 3 days because sitting alone in my apartment had felt worse than staying busy. My colleagues had been tactful about not asking questions. Only Simone knew the full story since she worked at the same firm. Julian tried to contact me multiple times through mutual friends. He'd call them asking them to pass messages to me. He'd sent flowers to my office with notes about how sorry he was. He'd written long emails that my spam filter eventually learned to catch. Every attempt at contact made me angrier, because he still didn't seem to understand that what he'd done wasn't fixable. He'd destroyed my trust so completely that we couldn't even be in the same room. I'd blocked him on every platform and told everyone I knew not to facilitate any communication. Most people respected that. A few tried to play mediator, suggesting that everyone makes mistakes and maybe I was being too harsh. I cut those people out too, because anyone who thought attempted bigamy was a mistake I should forgive clearly didn't have my best interests at heart. Elise's ethics complaint moved forward through the State Bar Association. Julian's law firm put him on leave while they investigated whether his personal conduct reflected poorly on the firm's reputation. Several of his colleagues reached out to me expressing shock and apologizing for not knowing what he'd been doing. His best friend from law school called and said he felt sick knowing he'd attended our engagement party and toasted our future while Julian was lying to everyone. He said he'd considered Julian one of his closest friends and now questioned everything about their relationship. I told him that was how I felt too. When someone revealed themselves to be fundamentally dishonest, it poisoned every memory. You couldn't separate the good moments from the lies because the lies had enabled the good moments. 3 months after the failed wedding, Elise finalized her divorce. Julian had stopped fighting it once his firm threatened to fire him if the ethics investigation found wrongdoing. He'd agreed to a settlement giving Elise full custody with minimal supervised visitation, the house, and most of their shared assets. His lawyer told him continued fighting would make him look worse to the Bar Association, and he needed to demonstrate remorse and cooperation. So he'd signed everything Elise requested and tried to frame it as taking the high road. Elise called me the day the divorce was final, and we met for coffee to celebrate. She seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted. She said Claire was doing better in therapy and adjusting to Julian not being a regular presence. She said it was sad but also freeing to not have to maintain the fiction of a happy family anymore. The Bar Association concluded their investigation after 6 months. They found Julian had violated ethical rules about honest dealing and conduct, reflecting adversely on fitness to practice law. He received a public reprimand and was placed on probation for 2 years. His law firm demoted him and removed him from the partnership track. He'd essentially destroyed his career along with his relationships. I felt satisfaction knowing there were real consequences, not just personal ones. Men like Julian often charmed their way out of accountability, but this time the institutions had actually done their jobs. Elise said the reprimand would be permanently on his record, and every future employer or client would see it. His reputation in the legal community was permanently damaged. The ambitious attorney who'd seemed so successful had revealed himself as a fraud who couldn't maintain basic honesty. I started dating again after 8 months. though it felt terrifying to trust anyone after what Julian had done. My therapist said it was healthy to take time, but also important not to let one person's betrayal prevent me from future connections. I'd been seeing her weekly since the failed wedding, working through trust issues and figuring out what red flags I'd missed. She'd helped me understand that Julian's deception wasn't my fault. Manipulative people are skilled at hiding their true natures. I couldn't blame myself for believing someone who'd systematically constructed an entire false persona. She'd helped me develop better boundaries and questions to ask new partners. I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off, rather than explaining away concerns. I met someone new through Simone's boyfriend. His name was David, and he worked in architecture. On our first date, I told him upfront about my history with Julian. I said I'd recently ended a relationship where I'd discovered major lies and I needed complete honesty going forward. David appreciated the directness and shared his own history with a difficult breakup. We took things slowly, building trust through consistent honesty and transparency. He introduced me to his friends and family early. He invited me to his apartment right away and showed me his life without hesitation. Every interaction was the opposite of Julian's secrecy and compartmentalization. David was an open book and encouraged me to ask any questions I needed to feel secure. 6 months into dating, I still had moments of anxiety, but David never made me feel foolish for needing reassurance. A year after the failed wedding, I ran into Julian at a restaurant. I was there with David and some friends celebrating a coworker's birthday. Julian was alone at the bar, looking older and tired. He saw me and started to approach, but I shook my head firmly. He stopped and just watched me for a moment before turning back to his drink. I felt David tense beside me, and I squeezed his hand, telling him it was fine. We left shortly after, and I didn't look back. That glimpse of Julian alone at a bar was enough closure. He'd lost his family, his career reputation, and his future wife. He'd gambled everything on being able to maintain multiple deceptions and lost catastrophically. I'd moved on and built something healthy with someone honest. That was my revenge, simply being happy without him. Elise texted me occasionally with updates about Claire. She'd started kindergarten and was doing well. She rarely asked about Julian anymore since his supervised visits had become sporadic. Elise had started dating someone who treated Claire with genuine kindness. She said she finally understood what healthy love looked like after years of Julian's manipulation disguised as romance. We'd bonded over surviving the same sociopath and supporting each other through the aftermath. I'd attended Claire's birthday party and brought a present. Watching that little girl blow out her candles surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her made me grateful that Elise had called during my wedding vows. If she hadn't, I might have married Julian and eventually discovered the truth when Claire was my stepdaughter, and the damage would have been exponentially worse. 2 years after that phone call during my vows, I'm engaged again, this time to David. He proposed on a quiet beach at sunset with just the two of us present. No big production or elaborate planning, just honest emotion and a simple question. I said yes without hesitation because I trust him completely. We're having a small ceremony with close family and friends only. David's phone will be turned off and left in the car. We laugh about that sometimes. How my one requirement is no phones during the ceremony. He understands why and never makes me feel paranoid for needing that boundary. Our invitations specify an unplugged ceremony with no phones or cameras. Some guests might think it's excessive, but anyone who knows my history understands completely. I'm marrying a man who's never lied to me about who he is, who's shown me his whole life willingly, who's proven through consistent actions that his words match his reality. That's what love actually looks like, and I'm grateful I learned the difference before it was too late. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.